The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, where tumbleweeds danced like ghosts of forgotten dreams. Sarah Mackenzie stood behind the lace curtains of her boarding house window, watching the stranger dismount from his coal-black stallion with the fluid grace of a man born in the saddle. 5 years. 5 long, disappointing years of marriage to Harold Mackenzie had taught Sarah that some hungers could never be satisfied by weak men with gentle hands and apologetic whispers. Her husband had been a good provider, a decent man, but in the privacy of their bedroom, he'd proven as useful as a broken water pump in the desert. The stranger tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements deliberate and confident. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took in his imposing frame. Broad shoulders that strained against his worn leather vest, arms thick as fence posts from years of wrestling cattle and breaking wild horses. His hat cast shadows across a face carved from granite, all sharp angles and dangerous promises. "Ma'am?" Harold's voice startled her from her reverie. "That stranger's asking about a room for the night." Sarah smoothed her apron and descended the stairs, her heart hammering like a woodpecker against her ribs. The stranger stood in her parlor, hat in hand, his steel-gray eyes taking inventory of everything, including her. "Name's Colt Maverick," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper on silk. "Heard tell you rent rooms to travelers." "We do," Sarah managed, acutely aware of how his gaze lingered on the curve of her neck, the way her dress hugged her waist. "How long will you be staying, Mr. Maverick?" "Depends," Colt replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "On what kind of hospitality this town has to offer?" Harold stepped forward, oblivious to the electricity crackling between his wife and the stranger. "Sarah runs the finest boarding house in 3 counties. Clean sheets, hot meals, and Christian values." Colt's lips curved in a smile that was anything but Christian. "I'm sure Mrs. Mackenzie knows how to take care of a man's needs." Sarah felt heat bloom in her cheeks like desert roses after rain. "I'll show you to your room," she said quickly, grabbing the key from the hook. As they climbed the narrow stairs, Sarah was painfully aware of Colt's presence behind her, the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the masculine scent of horse and sweat and something indefinably wild. At the top of the stairs, she fumbled with the key, her hands trembling like autumn leaves. "Allow me," Colt murmured, his body pressing close behind her as he reached around to take the key. His chest brushed against her back and Sarah gasped at the contact, her knees threatening to buckle. The key turned with a soft click, and the door swung open to reveal the small but tidy room. Colt stepped inside, his eyes taking in the narrow bed, the washstand, the single window that looked out over the desert. "This'll do just fine," he said, tossing his saddlebags onto the bed. "Though I have to say, the view from here is mighty disappointing." "The desert can be beautiful if you know how to look at it," Sarah replied, moving to straighten the already perfect curtains. "I wasn't talking about the desert," Colt said quietly. Sarah turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her feel like a doe caught in a hunter's sights. "Mr. Maverick, Tell me something, Mrs. Mackenzie," Colt interrupted, moving closer until she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. "Does your husband know how to appreciate what he has?" Sarah's mouth went dry as dust. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Colt said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I can see it in your eyes. The hunger, the longing. You're like a wild Mustang trapped in a corral, dreaming of open plains and freedom." "You don't know anything about me," Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Colt reached out slowly, his calloused finger tracing the line of her jaw. "I know you've never been properly broken in. I know you've never felt the earth move beneath you like thunder across the plains. And I know," his thumb brushed across her lower lip, "that you're dying to find out what you've been missing." Sarah jerked away as if burned, her hand flying to her throat where her wedding ring hung on a thin chain. Harold had never bothered to get it sized properly, and it slipped off her finger constantly. Dinner is at 6, she said breathlessly, fleeing toward the door. Don't be late. Wouldn't dream of it, Colt called after her. I'm looking forward to sampling the local cuisine. Sarah practically ran down the stairs, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Harold would hear it from the kitchen. She pressed her back against the closed door, trying to catch her breath and failing miserably. For the first time in 5 years of marriage, Sarah Mackenzie felt truly alive and terrified and hungry for something she'd never tasted but desperately craved. Upstairs, she could hear Colt moving around, the creak of floorboards under his boots, the splash of water in the wash basin. She closed her eyes and imagined those strong hands washing away the dust of the trail, pictured the water running down his chest, his arms, his... Sarah, Harold's voice cut through her dangerous thoughts. You look flushed. Are you feeling all right? Just the heat, Sarah lied, fanning herself with her apron. I'll start dinner. But as she moved toward the kitchen, Sarah knew that the heat she was feeling had nothing to do with the Arizona sun and everything to do with the dangerous stranger upstairs, who looked at her like she was a treasure worth claiming. Dinner that evening was a study in torture disguised as polite conversation. Sarah had prepared her finest meal, roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread, and apple pie that filled the dining room with the scent of cinnamon and promise. But she could barely taste a bite, too aware of Colt's presence across the table. Harold dominated the conversation, regaling their guest with stories of his success in the dry goods business, completely oblivious to the way Colt's eyes followed Sarah's every movement. When she leaned forward to refill his coffee cup, Colt's gaze lingered on the curve of her neck, the glimpse of skin at her throat. When she reached across the table for the butter dish, his eyes traced the line of her arm like a man memorizing a map to buried treasure. Sarah makes the finest apple pie in the territory, Harold boasted, patting his modest belly. Though I keep telling her she uses too much spice. A woman should know restraint in all things. Colt's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes flashing dangerously. I disagree, he said quietly. Some things are meant to be savored with all the spice they can handle. The more fire, the better the experience. Sarah's cheeks burned as she met his gaze across the table. More coffee, Mr. Maverick? Please, Colt replied, his voice a low rumble. I find I have quite an appetite tonight. As Sarah poured, her hand trembled slightly, causing a drop of the hot liquid to splash onto Colt's wrist. Without thinking, she reached for her napkin to dab at the spot, her fingers brushing against his skin. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm like lightning striking a fence post. Colt's hand closed over hers, holding it against his wrist where she could feel his pulse beating strong and steady. Careful, he murmured, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. Hot things can burn if you're not prepared for them. Sarah snatched her hand back, her face flaming. I'm sorry, No harm done, Colt said, his eyes never leaving hers. Though I have to say, your touch is quite healing. Harold, finally noticing the tension crackling between his wife and their guest, cleared his throat loudly. Well, I should check on the books before bed. Sarah, don't keep our guest up too late with your chatter. After Harold disappeared into his study, Sarah began clearing the dishes with nervous efficiency. Colt rose from his chair, moving to help despite her protests. You don't need to, Sarah began. I want to, Colt interrupted, his body brushing against hers as he reached for a plate. I believe in pulling my weight, especially when the work involves such pleasant company. They worked in silence, the air thick with unspoken desires. Every accidental touch, his fingers grazing hers as he handed her a dish, his arm brushing her shoulder as he reached past her, sent sparks through Sarah's nervous system like wildfire through dry grass. Tell me about your husband, Colt said suddenly as they stood side by side at the wash basin. Sarah's hands stilled in the soapy water. What about him? Does he make you happy? Colt's voice was deceptively casual, but Sarah could hear the steel beneath the silk. Harold is a good man, Sarah replied carefully. He provides well. He's never raised a hand to me. That's not what I asked, Colt pressed, moving closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Does he make you happy? Does he make you feel like a woman should feel? Sarah's breath caught in her throat. I don't know what you mean. Colt's hand covered hers in the warm water, his fingers intertwining with hers beneath the surface. I think you do. I think you know exactly what you're missing, what you've been denied all these years. Mr. Maverick, please. Colt, he corrected, his voice rough with desire. And I'm not talking about anything your husband should be giving you. I'm talking about fire, passion, the kind of satisfaction that leaves you breathless and begging for more. Sarah turned to face him, her back pressed against the wash basin, trapped between the counter and his imposing frame. You shouldn't say such things. Why? Colt challenged, his hands bracing on either side of her, caging her in. Because they're true? Because they make you ache in places your husband has never even thought to touch? Sarah's chest rose and fell rapidly, her breathing shallow and quick. You don't know anything about my marriage. I know enough, Colt said, his eyes dropping to her lips. I know you've never been properly appreciated, never been worshipped the way a woman like you deserves. I know you go to bed every night hungry and wake up every morning still starving. Stop, Sarah whispered. But there was no conviction in her voice. I could show you, Colt continued, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. I could teach you what it means to be truly satisfied, to have every inch of you explored and claimed and treasured. I could make you forget every disappointment, every unfulfilled promise. Sarah's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palms. We can't. I'm married. It's wrong. What's wrong? Colt said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Is letting yourself waste away in a marriage that gives you nothing but empty nights and broken dreams. What's wrong is denying yourself the pleasure you deserve. And what about you? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. What do you get out of this? Colt's smile was pure predator. The satisfaction of watching you come alive under my hands. The pleasure of hearing you scream my name when I take you to places you've never been. The knowledge that I've given you something no other man ever could. Sarah's knees went weak at his words, her body responding to promises her mind couldn't quite process. I need to think. Don't think, Colt advised, his lips brushing against her ear. Feel. For once in your life, stop thinking and just feel. The sound of Harold's footsteps on the stairs broke the spell, and Sarah pushed past Colt with a strangled gasp. I have to go, she whispered, fleeing toward the stairs. Sarah, Colt called softly, and she turned back despite herself. When you're lying in bed tonight thinking about what I said, remember this. I'm just upstairs. All you have to do is knock. Sarah ran up the stairs like the devil himself was chasing her, her heart pounding and her body aching with needs she'd never acknowledged before. As she slipped into bed beside her snoring husband, she knew that sleep would be impossible. Because upstairs, Colt Maverick was waiting. And for the first time in her life, Sarah Mackenzie was tempted to take what she wanted instead of settling for what she had. 3 days passed like tumbleweeds rolling across the desert, each one bringing Sarah closer to the edge of a precipice she'd never imagined herself approaching. Colt had been the perfect gentleman in Harold's presence, polite, respectful, discussing cattle prices and weather patterns with the easy charm of a born storyteller. But when Harold left for his weekly trip to the bank in the next town, the mask slipped away like morning mist, revealing the predator beneath. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she felt eyes on her like the desert sun. Intense, warming, impossible to ignore. She turned to find Colt leaning against the back porch, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with the patience of a mountain cat stalking its prey. Your husband's gone, he observed, his voice carrying easily across the small yard. He'll be back by evening, Sarah replied. trying to keep her voice steady as she pinned one of Harold's shirts to the line. "That gives us plenty of time," Colt said, pushing off from the porch and walking toward her with that predatory grace that made her pulse quicken. "Time for what?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer would set her blood on fire. "To finish what we started in the kitchen," Colt replied, stopping just close enough that she could smell leather and masculine sweat and something wild that made her mouth water. "To explore those hungers you've been denying." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for another clothespin. "I told you I'm married." "I can't what?" Colt challenged, moving closer until she was trapped between his body and the clothesline. "Can't admit that you want me? Can't acknowledge that you've been thinking about my hands on your body every night for the past 3 days?" Sarah's breath hitched as his fingers traced the line of her arm from shoulder to wrist, leaving trails of fire in their wake. "Mr. Maverick, Colt," he corrected, his voice rough as gravel. "Say my name, Sarah. I want to hear it on your lips." "Colt," she whispered, and the sound seemed to snap something inside him. His hands framed her face, thumbs stroking across her cheekbones as he stared down at her with eyes that burned like banked coals. "Do you know what you do to me? Do you have any idea how hard it's been to keep my hands off you, to pretend I don't want to strip you bare and worship every inch of your skin?" Sarah's knees went weak at his words, her hands coming up to grip his wrists for support. "We can't. If Harold found out, Harold's a fool," Colt growled. "Any man who can't see what a treasure he has doesn't deserve to keep it. You're wasting away, Sarah, dying a little more each day in a marriage that gives you nothing but empty promises and cold sheets." "And what are you offering?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "What can you give me that he can't?" Colt's smile was pure sin. "Everything. Pleasure beyond your wildest dreams. Satisfaction so complete you'll forget every disappointment, every unfulfilled night. I'll make you feel like the goddess you are, worship you the way you deserve to be worshipped." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "I'll show you what it means to be truly alive, to have every nerve ending singing with pleasure. I'll take you to heights you've never imagined and catch you when you fall." "I'm scared," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Of me?" Colt asked, his expression softening slightly. "Of myself," Sarah replied. "Of what I might do." "Of what I might become." Colt's hands slid down to her waist, pulling her closer until she could feel the heat of his body through her dress. "You'll become what you were always meant to be. A woman who knows her own worth, who takes what she wants instead of settling for scraps." "And after?" Sarah whispered. "What happens when you ride away?" "Because men like you always ride away." "Maybe," Colt admitted, his honesty brutal and refreshing. "But wouldn't you rather have one perfect day, one moment of true satisfaction, than a lifetime of empty nights and broken dreams?" Sarah stared up at him, seeing her own desperate hunger reflected in his eyes. She thought of Harold, snoring peacefully beside her every night while she lay awake aching for something she couldn't name. She thought of the years stretching ahead, empty and unfulfilled. A slow death by degrees. "One day," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like a confession. Colt's eyes blazed with triumph and something deeper, more dangerous. "One day," he agreed, his voice rough with promise. "But I warn you, Sarah, once you've tasted what I have to offer, you'll never be satisfied with anything less." "Then don't give me anything less," Sarah said, surprising herself with her boldness. "If we're going to do this, if I'm going to risk everything, then I want it all. I want to know what I've been missing, what I've been denied all these years." Colt's control snapped like a dry twig. His mouth crashed down on hers, claiming her lips with a hunger that had been building for days. Sarah melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with equal desperation. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Colt rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as he struggled for control. "Inside," he commanded, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Now, before I take you right here against the clothesline for all the world to see." Sarah's face flamed at his words, but she didn't protest as he took her hand and led her toward the house. At the back door, she hesitated, her hand on the knob. "Last chance," Colt said quietly. "Once we cross this threshold, there's no going back. You'll be mine, completely and utterly, for as long as I choose to keep you." Sarah looked back at the laundry fluttering in the breeze, Harold's shirts and her own modest dresses, symbols of a life that had never truly been hers. Then she looked at Colt, at the promise of fire and passion and satisfaction beyond her wildest dreams. "Then keep me," she whispered, turning the knob and stepping into the house. Colt followed her inside, his eyes never leaving her face as she led him through the kitchen and up the stairs to her bedroom, the room she'd shared with Harold for 5 years without ever truly sharing anything at all. "Are you sure?" Colt asked one final time, his hand on the bedroom door. Sarah reached up and began unbuttoning her dress, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." And as the door closed behind them, Sarah Mackenzie finally understood what it meant to be truly alive. The afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom curtains, casting golden shadows across the modest room that had never seen such passion. Sarah stood before Colt like a desert flower finally receiving rain, her dress pooled at her feet, her skin glowing in the honeyed light. "Beautiful," Colt breathed, his voice rough with reverence and desire. "More beautiful than I imagined, and I've been imagining plenty." Sarah's hands moved to cover herself, a lifetime of modesty warring with newfound boldness, but Colt caught her wrists gently. "Don't hide from me," he commanded softly. "I want to see all of you, every curve, every secret place that's been neglected for too long." His eyes mapped her body like a cartographer charting new territory, taking in the swell of her breasts, the curve of her waist, the long line of her legs. Sarah had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, yet so powerful all at once. "Your turn," she whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. Colt's smile was pure predator as he began unbuttoning his shirt with deliberate slowness. "Eager, are we? I like that in a woman, knowing what she wants and not being afraid to ask for it." Sarah's breath caught as his shirt fell away, revealing a chest carved from granite and scarred by years of hard living. Her fingers itched to trace the lines of muscle, to explore the map of his body the way he'd explored hers with his eyes. "Touch me," Colt commanded, reading her thoughts. "I want to feel your hands on me. Want to know what it's like to be touched by a woman who actually wants to be here." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached out, her palms flattening against his chest. His skin was hot as a brand, the muscles beneath jumping at her touch. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, as wild and untamed as the rest of him. "That's it," Colt encouraged, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "Don't be shy. Take what you want." Sarah's exploration grew bolder, her hands mapping the planes of his chest, the ridges of his abdomen, the powerful muscles of his arms. Each touch sent sparks through her nervous system, awakening parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. "Sarah," Colt groaned, his control hanging by a thread. "If you keep touching me like that, I won't be able to take my time with you." "Maybe I don't want you to take your time," Sarah replied, amazed at her own daring. "Maybe I've waited long enough." Colt's eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful what you wish for, darling. I'm not a gentle man when I'm pushed past my limits." "Good," Sarah breathed. "I don't want gentle. I've had 5 years of gentle and it got me nowhere. I want fire. I want passion. I want to feel like a woman instead of a piece of furniture." Something primitive and possessive flared in Colt's eyes. With a growl that was more animal than human, he swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed, laying her down like she was made of spun gold. "Then fire is what you'll get," he promised, his voice rough as desert wind. "I'm going to show you pleasures you've never dreamed of. Take you to heights that will leave you breathless and begging for more." What followed was a masterclass in seduction, a symphony of touch and taste and whispered promises that left Sarah gasping and writhing beneath Colt's skilled ministrations. He worshipped her body like a man paying homage to a goddess, his hands and mouth finding secret places that Harold had never even thought to explore. "Please," Sarah gasped, her nails digging into his shoulders as he built the fire within her to unbearable heights.
I can't.
I know what you need, Colt growled against her throat, and I'm going to give it to you, all of it. Until you're screaming my name and forgetting you were ever married to anyone else. When he finally claimed her completely, Sarah understood for the first time what all the fuss was about. This wasn't the fumbling, apologetic coupling she'd endured with Harold. This was conquest and surrender, fire and ice. A dance as old as time itself. Colt moved within her with the rhythm of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, building her pleasure with the patience of a master craftsman. Sarah had never felt so full, so complete, so utterly possessed. That's it, Colt encouraged, his voice rough with his own need. Let go, Sarah, let me hear you sing, and sing she did, her voice rising in a crescendo that echoed through the small house, proclaiming to the desert afternoon that Sarah Mackenzie had finally discovered what she'd been missing all these years. The thunder that followed shook the very foundations of the house, leaving them both breathless and trembling in its wake. Sarah collapsed against Colt's chest, her body still humming with aftershocks, her mind reeling from the intensity of what they'd shared. My God, she whispered against his skin. I never knew. I never imagined. That was just the beginning, Colt promised, his arms tightening around her. I'm nowhere near done with you yet, and he wasn't. As the afternoon wore on, Colt proved his words again and again, showing Sarah pleasures she'd never dreamed possible, taking her to heights that left her gasping and begging for mercy that never came. By the time the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah had been thoroughly and completely claimed. She lay in Colt's arms, her body sated and singing, her heart full of a satisfaction she'd never thought possible. Harold will be home soon, she whispered, though the thought of her husband seemed distant and unimportant. I know, Colt replied, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin. But this isn't over, Sarah. What we have, it's too powerful to ignore. Sarah lifted her head to look at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied by half measures again, Colt said, his voice serious. You've tasted what real passion feels like now. Can you honestly go back to settling for less? Sarah thought of Harold, of their cold, empty marriage, of the years of disappointment and unfulfilled longing. Then she looked at Colt, at the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly alive. No, she whispered, the word torn from her throat like a confession. I can't. Colt's smile was triumphant and tender all at once. Then don't. Come with me when I leave. Let me show you what life can be like when you stop settling for scraps and start demanding the feast you deserve. As the sound of Harold's wagon approached in the distance, Sarah made her choice. She kissed Colt with all the passion and gratitude in her heart, tasting freedom and fire and the promise of a future filled with satisfaction beyond her wildest dreams. The cowboy had indeed done what her husband couldn't do in 5 years of marriage. He had satisfied her completely, body and soul, and Sarah Mackenzie would never settle for less again.